And we just commit it to you, Father, in the matchless name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. We're studying the historical progression of the Old Testament, beginning with the primeval times in Genesis 1 through 11, and followed by the patriarchal age in Genesis, focusing on Abraham up until the enslavement of his descendants, and then their deliverance in Exodus with Moses. An excellent lesson on that last week. And we've come now to what we refer to as the era of the Judges. This period is recorded for us in the books of Joshua and Judges and Ruth. So fasten your seatbelts for a roller coaster journey through an exciting and perilous adventure that's chronicled in the text that we have before us today. You have your notes. There are no blanks to fill in, but you have an outline and a wide margin to jot down your thoughts and questions. You have all of the Bible references and so forth that you'll need. Your notes are designed to provide a framework to read through these books, hopefully in the coming week. And I have no idea how we're going to take this journey together in 1 hour. So I have scripted my remarks to disparage me and discourage me from extemporaneous digressions. You'll leave here with an outline and some maps and some supplemental material to help you navigate Joshua and Judges, and I suggest that you try to add the book of Ruth as well if you can. Some of this is supplemental material that we won't be necessarily covering in class, but it will be helpful. Particularly the maps will be helpful to you, I think. Joshua was written by Joshua himself, with a short addendum at the end penned by an unknown contemporary to record the death of Joshua. And it encompasses about 16 to 20 years. And then the book of Judges about another 340 years or so. If you want a familiar time reference of the span of history that we're going to look at today, think back to the arrival of the English settlers in North America as 13 colonies were formed, eventually comprising a union that ultimately became the United States of America up until this present day. All in the approximate time that's covered by Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Now, how must the children of Abraham have viewed the onset of this era? It had been hundreds of years since God promised Abraham his posterity would have an inheritance in the land of Canaan. And since then, Israel had endured a 430-year sojourn in Egypt that led to slavery, a subsequent deliverance through Moses, the establishment of the law, the sacrificial ordinances, and over 40 years of wandering in an inhospitable desert. And they're finally about to occupy the land, the so-called promised land, described as a land of milk and honey. But folks, it's called the promised land because God promised it to them, not because it offered them a promising prospect of comfort and ease. The land was occupied by fierce enemies who were characterized by all manner of evil. They were idolaters, many of which offered their children as sacrifices to false gods. They were sinful, violent, depraved people. And if the Hebrew children are to acquire it, they will have to fight for it and to subdue a ruthless enemy. And God has commanded them to do just that. They are to give no quarter, and the destruction of the Canaanites is to be decisive and ruthless. We will see that they failed in a great deal of that. Adding to that, Moses, who spoke directly with God, has died. And once before, they'd stood at the entrance to Canaan and turned back. You remember, 12 spies had assessed the challenge, and all but 2 had quaked at the strength of the Canaanites. And they turned back to the wilderness until the entire adult generation died. Only 2 who were willing to trust God, Joshua and Caleb, were left. Moses was instructed by God to set apart Joshua to take his place leading Israel, as recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 31. And as Joshua opens, God now speaks to Joshua as he did to Moses. and reassures him that the time has come to realize the promise to Abraham, and he makes this promise to Joshua. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to your fathers. Joshua's name is an Old Testament rendering of Jesus. It means Yahweh is salvation, informing us that there's much about Joshua that prefigures our Lord Jesus Christ. In Joshua 5:14 and 15, he came face to face with the captain of the hosts of the Lord. This is a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of the second person of the Trinity. We've all been talking about how these Old Testament passages point to Jesus. Well, here we see him manifest in the Old Testament, and we'll see at least 5 of these in our lesson today. Joshua was about 90 when he assumed leadership of the people of Israel. That might give us cause to reflect on the realization that our usefulness to God is not contingent upon our age. Abraham was 99 when God made a covenant with him. Moses was 80 before he began his ministry. Joshua served God until he was 110. I'm convinced that if we're alive, God has a purpose for us. And we ought to be about our Father's business as demonstrated by our Lord Jesus Christ himself. You see, life is not about retirement. It's about recruitment. I'm encouraged that all of you are here today indicating a desire to become more mature in knowledge and worship and witness. And I hope we are all praying that God will reveal to us how we may use what we learn here today for the glory of God. They were finally to cross over Jordan and secure their homesteads in the land of Canaan. And you can see one of the maps that you have there. It shows a picture of the land before it was apportioned. For the sake of brevity, I've divided Joshua into 5 sections, and the first of these is just simply considering the task in Joshua chapter 2. Spies are dispatched, but this time they reached a very different conclusion. There were only 2 instead of 12. I suspect Joshua was careful to avoid the influence of a larger group that might again disparage God's plan, and carefully chose 2 men of faith and determination to obey God this time, but that's my speculation. Instead of quaking at the thought of giants in the land, the spies discovered that the testimony of God's previous miraculous deliverance had instilled fear in the hearts of the inhabitants of the land. And significant was the testimony and assistance of a prostitute named Rahab. She not only instilled confidence in the hearts of the spies, but presents us with a beautiful picture of the grace of God. This sinful but repentant woman submitted to God with the result that she and her family were spared. It's another Old Testament picture of the ministry of our Lord Jesus Christ. As Joshua, Yahweh will save, spared the harlot Rahab, so Jesus came into the world to save sinners. In fact, in Luke 5:32 records the words of Jesus saying, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. You see, Jesus died for sinners. The righteous need not apply. No righteous person has ever been saved. Now, the second division of Joshua is crossing the Jordan River in chapters 3 through 5. Israel miraculously crossed the Jordan River when God parted the waters as he did at the Red Sea. And this too was a forceful testimony of God's power over the elements. And as in Egypt, as has been pointed out to us, demonstrated God's superiority over the false gods of the Canaanites. But before they could proceed to conquer Jericho, there was some unfinished business. It was time for remembering. God directed them into 2 acts of consecration in Joshua chapter 5. The first was a covenant mark. They were to be circumcised. You remember many years before, all the males of Israel had been circumcised, but since then an entire generation had died off, and they had not circumcised those who had been born since. Circumcision was an act of identification as the unique people of God. It was a covenant mark. The second, a covenant meal. After they had healed from the circumcision came the observance of Passover, testifying of their deliverance from Egypt, and in a New Testament sense, looking forward to Christ as the ultimate Passover lamb. Passover marked the beginning of the Jewish religious year with a covenant meal. And that same day, the manna that had fed them throughout their wandering in the desert was no longer provided. From this day forward, they were to till the land that was promised. And so now they're ready for the conquest of the land itself in chapters 6 through 12. To fully understand the impact of this conquest, we must refresh our understanding of God's direction with regard to occupying the land. That's found in Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verses 16 and 17, where it's recorded for us their instructions with regard to the Canaanites. In the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. There's a good start. But you shall utterly destroy them, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. This sounds cruel to us today, doesn't it? But these people were so degenerate and committed to evil that if not destroyed, they could and did draw the Israelites into their detestable idolatry and wickedness. Now, the conquest of Canaan took the form of 3 military campaigns, and the first of these was the Central Campaign in verses 6 through 8. The first series of battles introduces us to the good, the bad, the ugly, and the impossible, seen in the account of the battles of Jericho and Ai, separated by the sin of Achan and punctuated by the deception of the Gibeonites and the resulting battle. The good was the impressive victory over Jericho. Now, we all know the story of how they marched around the city and the walls fell down, leaving the city unprotected, the slaughter that followed. For all the exhilaration associated with the miraculous victory at Jericho, what confounds us most is the bad, the demoralizing defeat at Ai. These 2 battles offer us an important contrast in which God brings a great victory against the heavily fortified city of Jericho, followed shortly by a stunning defeat at the nearby sparsely defended town of Ai. We sing the familiar spiritual, Joshua at the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, right? We all know that song, don't we? But there are no songs about Ai, because it represents a defeat that stems from an individual's rebellion against God. The Israelites were dismissive of the defenses of Ai and sent only a token force against them, and Israel was soundly defeated. We often think of this drubbing as a result of overconfidence, but not so. Joshua prayed to God and was told that the defeat was the consequence of sin in the camp. God had instructed the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. That means to be set apart, to go into the treasury of the Lord. But someone had secretly brought a curse upon the people by coveting some of the things under the ban. Lots were cast, and Achan of the tribe of Judah was exposed, and judgment was swift, as Achan confessed, and he and the booty and his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him were brought before the people. And all Israel stoned them with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them. It's a striking reminder that when there is sin in the camp, the name, that is the reputation of God, is dishonored, and all the congregation bears the brunt of it. In this case, 36 men had been killed in the battle, and added to that was Achan himself, as well as an unknown number of sons and daughters who were lost, not to mention his possessions. The tragedy of this defeat was that no one other than Achan, and I suspect his family, knew anything about his sin. Nevertheless, his disobedience brought misfortune upon the entire assembly. It should lead us to consider that each of us who have entered into a covenant with God, as we do, for instance, in joining a church, are likewise responsible before God to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please Him in all respects. For He is not unaware of the discredit that is brought upon His name by our private sins. And more often than we know, the entire congregation is impacted as God vindicates the glory of His name, of His reputation. Next, we see the ugly, the deception of the Gibeonites in Joshua 9. The peril of failure to consult God before we make our commitments is illustrated here. The Gibeonites, who were the next to be conquered, clad themselves in worn-out clothing and bought stale food as though they had traveled a very long distance, presenting themselves as travelers from a far distant country, seeking to enact a treaty with Israel. And so Israel entered into a covenant and swore an oath of peace. But 3 days later, they learned that they were already on the border of the Gibeonites. So Israel's hands were tied by their oath, and instead of destroying the Gibeonites as God has commanded, they spared them and made them servants instead. And their willingness to foolishly act without consulting the Lord was the cause of hundreds of years of hardship. It's not difficult to find the lesson in this account. We tend to rush into action without first seeking God's direction, don't we? That is an ever-present concern in ministry. I fear that much of what passes as ministry these days are prayerless projects or spiritless speculation. Sadly, there's a tendency to first devise a course of action and then go to God to ask for His blessing upon it and then call it the will of God. So this event in Joshua reminds us to first seek God's face before we seek His favor. Now, the central campaign concluded then with the impossible. Joshua chapter 10 gives us a remarkable account of a miraculous intervention of God when Joshua confronted 5 kings at Gibeon. As they fled Joshua's forces, Joshua prayed to God that he just didn't have enough time left in the day to kill them. And he asked God to cause the sun to stand still in Gibeon, where the battle was taking place. Joshua 10:13 records, so the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Now this long day requires some clarification. Some have insisted that this account is a striking example of a conflict between the Bible and science. Skeptics scoff at the assertion that the sun stood still. But the Bible text employs a common language of description. We still speak in those terms today, saying that the sun has gone down when it disappears on the horizon, though we understand that it's the Earth's rotation that gives that appearance. We commonly say that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but we understand that it's the rotation of the Earth that makes it appear so. Joshua asked God to make the sun stand still in Gibeon. That is, that the shadow would not advance on the sundial in Gibeon. Bear in mind that in those days, time was told by recording the movement of a shadow on a sundial. As the earth rotated, the shadow would move until darkness came. The sun in our text was said to be in the middle of the sky when Joshua prayed. The best explanation, I think, is that in answer to Joshua's prayer, God slowed the rotation of the earth so that it appeared on the sundial that the sun was standing still and the daylight did not disperse. Scholars have reasoned that for that day, the rotation of the earth took about 48 hours instead of 24 hours. And during that time, God simply stopped the cataclysmic effects that would otherwise have occurred. This, of course, was an astounding miracle, showing that indeed God is master of the universe, and even the heavenly bodies obey him. Scripture concludes in Joshua 10:14, there was no day like that, before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. After this, they turned their attention to the southern campaign in Joshua chapter 10. They occupied the land as far south as Kadesh Barnea, from where over 40 years prior they had turned back from the promised land. And finally, they returned north in the northern campaign in Joshua 11. They fought from the waters of Merom to the valley of Mizpah and controlled the land to the north. And then the conquests are summarized in Joshua 11 and 12, and they are encapsulated in Joshua 11, 18, and 23. Joshua waged a war a long time with all these kings. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest for war. These conflicts took about 7 years, give or take. Joshua led them for about 16 years. Unfortunately, they had not completely obeyed God's instructions, and they had not fully displaced the wicked people of Canaan. And that oversight has brought about trouble for Israel to this very day. And that brings you to the conveyance of the land itself in chapters 13 through 22. And you can refer there to the map that you have of the tribal regions in your packet. Following the battles, Joshua took up the task of apportioning the land west of the Jordan River to the respective tribes. The land east of the river, you'll recall, had been assigned to the half-tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuben by Moses. It's significant to observe that much of the apportioned land had yet to be occupied at this time. Joshua 13 notes that all the lands of the Philistines, the Phoenicians, and Lebanon on the Mediterranean coast had not yet been conquered. And you can see that on your map of Canaan. Nevertheless, the land was apportioned to the tribes of Israel. As you read, you will again and again and again be reminded of the consequence of their failure to follow God's instruction with regard to the annihilation of these wicked pagan cultures that continually lured the Israelites into idolatry. That is much of the message that we'll find when we get to the book of Judges in just a few minutes. God had given Moses explicit instruction to set apart 48 cities for the inheritance of the Levites, 6 of which were to be cities of refuge. And so Joshua apportioned cities of refuge in chapter 20. And you have a map of those 6 cities. We have provided you with a map where someone could go if they accidentally or justifiably took a life so they could escape the revenge of a family member until they could have a fair adjudication of the matter. And cities for the residents. Cities were set apart for the Levites to reside in accordance with the instructions given to Moses. 48 cities in all. You have a map of that in all 48 cities, but many of them. Somewhat related to the ministry of the Levites, however, was the altar controversy that we find in Joshua 22. After the conveyance of their tribal lands, it was time for the 3 tribes who had been given their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan to finally cross back over the river to occupy their land. And as the sons of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh returned home, they built an altar on the western side of the Jordan. And this created a misunderstanding on the part of the other 9 tribes who saw it as a denigration of the authorized altar at the tabernacle. And this threatened a civil war when the 9 western tribes gathered at Shiloh to do battle with the 3 eastern tribes. But a delegation from the 9 tribes, led by the priest Phinehas, confronted the 3 eastern tribes, insisting that God would bring judgment upon all of them because of their action that they understood as compromising the worship of God. Perhaps he was thinking of Achan or something of that nature. The Easterners explained that their altar was not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. It was erected as a memorial so that they might not in time be isolated from the 9 western tribes. And when the 9 tribes learned that the 3 tribes had not committed an unfaithful act against the Lord, the civil war was averted. And the final section of Joshua is found in chapters 23 and 24, which is really a recommitment. After many days, Joshua was to lead them to recommit to their covenant with God. He gathered the tribes to 2 convocations in which he called the elders and judges and people and rehearsed how God had delivered them and fought for them. At this time, Joshua made the statement, which is probably the most familiar statement in the book. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Probably we're all familiar with that verse. Perhaps have it on your door, right? I was just about to say, perhaps you even have it on a plaque in our home or embroidered on our couch pillows. The people quickly responded with the declaration of agreement to serve the Lord, after which Joshua told them to put away the foreign gods that were already accepted in their midst. Think about that. Some of them had already begun to tolerate idolatry. Didn't take long, did it? Less than 10 years. Significantly less probably than 10 years. And so it was that Joshua led them once again to renew their covenant with God. His ministry comprised about 16 years, about half of which was occupied with warfare. And Joshua 24:31 concludes, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Joshua 24:31. And that brings us to Judges. This period began about 1406 BC, when Israel had finally occupied much of the land promised to Abraham. It extends to when the prophet Samuel became prominent and the establishment of a king in Israel about 1050 BC. Commentators refer to this period as a theocracy, a system of government in which priests rule in the name of God or a god. I think it's perhaps more aptly described, however, in Judges 21:25 as a period when everyone did what was right in his own eyes, that being the summary conclusion of the book of Judges. Let's look first at the historical context in the first couple of chapters. Judges is probably written by the prophet Samuel somewhere around 1051 BC, shortly after the coronation of Saul as king. Acts 13:20 says that God gave Israel judges until Samuel, and Acts 3:24 speaks of Samuel as the first of the prophets. We ought not to think of the judges as we perceive judges today. They were in a real sense military leaders. We should look at them more as determined warriors. Judges 2:16 describes them saying, Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. For the most part, their activities were offensive rather than defensive, responding to a particular oppression. They had a regional impact. These judges were not necessarily national figures like we might associate with the centralized government. The judges were raised up out of one or more tribes to face specific challenges from invaders or oppressors. And these invasions may or may not have directly affected all the tribes at the same time or in the same way. The judges were often secular in nature. Though the Spirit of the Lord came upon them, they were not necessarily what you would call godly examples. Some, like Samson, were self-centered, impulsive, ambitious. Some, like Gideon, were weak or timid. Ehud was deceptive, even murderous. Gideon was a serial polygamist. In this era of the judges, it's noticeable that God's blessing does not always flow from their obedience. No one can look back on this period and assert that human merit had anything whatsoever to do with the preservation of God's people, showing us the grace of God, even then, back in the Old Testament. The writer immediately commences to recount all of the Canaanites that were not driven out of the land. Judges 2:10 tells us, after the death of Joshua, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Pretty frightening thing when you stop to think that this was probably a period of less than 10 years.
Why didn't they teach their children about God?
I beg your pardon?
Why didn't they teach their children about God?
Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question, because
their parents never taught them about God. Like today.
they were focused more on the world, and we have a lesson in the New Testament. It kind of reminds us of this dilemma: love not the world, neither the things of the world.
You go through this seems like what's happening today.
Yep, we're coming to that. You're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And underlying this entire period in Israel's history is the covenant regarding the land, and that we read about in the first part of chapter 2. In Judges 2, they're confronted by the angel of the Lord. This, of course, is another Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of our Lord Jesus, one of 4 in the book of Judges. This appears to be a heavenly affirmation of Joshua's challenge to them before he died. God assures them that he will not break his covenant with Israel, but reproves them for already having broken it with the Canaanites. And that betrayal constituted a contempt of their covenant with God, and thereby a denigration of his name. And the remainder of the book illustrates the consequence of their failure to seek and savor their devotion to God. There will follow a pattern of spiritual neglect that manifests itself in 7 cycles of idolatry, chastening, deliverance, and peace. And God will manifest his grace to them by conscripting 12 judges to deliver them and draw them back to his covenant. I use the term conscription because it fits with our understanding of the judges here as martial warriors who are raised up by God to deliver the people. So let's briefly look at the conscription of the judges in Judges chapter 3 through chapter 16. 12 judges are named in association with 7 cycles of idolatry, chastening, and deliverance, leading to a period of peace, only to repeat itself when once again the people are lured into idolatry. 3 of these cycles of departure involve multiple judges, accounting for the disparity in number. There are 7 cycles, but there are 12 judges. The first of these cycles was the result of Israelites, and this will partly answer your question, is the result of Israelites who denigrated God by giving their children to the Canaanites in marriage. In time, we are told, they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth, Judges 3:7. These were Canaanite deities. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, and Asheroth was a female fertility goddess. And God's anger was kindled, and he gave them over to a Mesopotamian king who oppressed them for 8 years. When the people finally cried out to God, he conscripted the first judge, Othniel, of the tribe of Judah. Othniel, incidentally, was the nephew of Caleb, and he prevailed over the invading king, whose name meant double wickedness. And the land then had rest for 40 years. Again, the people did evil in the sight of the Lord. And God sent Eglon, king of Moab, against them and occupied the land of Reuben. They served Eglon for 18 years. And again, Israel cried out to God, and God raised up Ehud of the neighboring tribe of Benjamin. Now, Eglon was a very obese man, and Ehud, who was left-handed, brought a tribute to him, claiming he had a secret message. And when he was left alone with the king, he drew his sword with his left hand and thrust it in Eglon's belly. And then Ehud calmly left the room, closed and locked the door, and instructed the servants that the king did not wish to be disturbed. I guess not. He immediately alerted the men of Ephraim to battle, and they struck down about 10,000 to defeat the Moabites, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years, the longest period of rest in the time of the judges. Apparently late in Ehud's leadership, there was an incursion from the Philistines, and a second judge named Shamgar struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad to save Israel. And in the third cycle, God raised up Deborah, Judges 4 and 5. Again, the sons of Israel did evil after Ehud died, and Jabin, the king of Canaan, oppressed them for 20 years. Now, Deborah was a prophetess of the tribe of Ephraim and the only female judge. She called on Barak to take an army from the tribes of Naphtali and nearby Zebulun to fight Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army. Barak and Deborah took an army of 10,000 to Kedesh in the territory of Naphtali and routed the vastly superior forces of Sisera, whose entire army was killed. But Sisera fled to the tent of an ally named Heber to escape. And while Sisera slept, the wife of Heber, Jael, took a hammer and a tent peg and drove it through his temple. And Sisera died. And Deborah had prophesied to Barak, because he wouldn't go without her, that he'd be killed by a woman. And the land then knew rest for 40 years, until the fourth cycle. Again, the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and this time God gave them over to Midian in the far south. That would be Arabia. This period of oppression was not characterized by an occupying force, but once each year at harvest time, the Midianites would come north and steal the produce and livestock, leaving nothing for Israel. And their plundering was so devastating that they were compared to locusts. And they did this for 7 years. Now Gideon of the tribe of Manasseh was beating out the wheat to hide it from the seasonal incursion, of the Midianites, when the angel of the Lord appeared to him. Another Christophany. Now Gideon was a rather timid fellow, and God addressed him saying, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian." And Gideon tested God by asking for a series of signs to assure him. You remember he asked to put out a fleece of wool on the threshing floor to see if in the morning the ground would be dry but the fleece would be wet? And when it was so, he asked for another sign to put out a fleece that would be dry, but all the ground around it would be wet, and again it was so. Now, lots of folks have taken this account as a basis for testing God and dictating a so-called fleece as a means of seeking God's will. But it's incumbent on me to remind you that though God was gracious to Gideon on this occasion, it is by no means a pattern to be entered into lightly or inadvisedly. The lesson we should see in this event is the weakness of Gideon's faith and the stubbornness of his heart. God had already made his will clear and evident, far preferable that Gideon simply obey God and accept his word. A notable lesson from Gideon is the culling of the army that he then led against the Midianites. Gideon was facing a vastly superior army, yet God said to him, "The people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hands, for Israel would become boastful, saying, 'My own power has delivered me.'" And so God instructed him to send back everyone who was afraid, and 22,000 people went home. There were 10,000 left. Still, God said there were too many, and God instructed him to further reduce the army to 300. And with that token force, God sent the army of Midian packing in fear. And Gideon found it necessary then to recruit men from the tribes of Naphtali and Asher to pursue them as they fled, because he only had 300 people in his army. Under Gideon, Israel was left undisturbed for 40 years, until the 5th cycle. As soon as Gideon was dead, the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals. From here on out, there is no record of a period of rest between the judges of Israel as before. God's chastening this time did not come from a foreign threat, but an internal one. Gideon was also called Jerubbaal. He had many wives and 70 sons. He also had a concubine who bore him another son named Abimelech, who after the death of Zerubbabel, that is Gideon, hired some worthless and reckless fellows and killed all 70 of his brothers except for the youngest, Jotham. Abimelech came from the city of Shechem in Manasseh, his mother's home, and the men of that city crowned him a king. He ruled there for 3 years, after which Shechem revolted and Abimelech was ambushed and killed. A woman in a tower dropped a millstone on his head. It's interesting, as he was dying, he asked his armor bearer to kill him, so it wouldn't be said he was slain by a woman. Must have been something in those days, I don't know. Notably, it doesn't appear that God raised up a judge in this instance. But there were 2 judges in Israel following that time. Very little is said of them, so they're often referred to as minor judges. They were Tola of Issachar and Jair, a Gileadite, and they ministered, the 2 of them combined, for 45 years. 4 judges were employed in the 6th cycle. The enemy this time were the Philistines and the Ammonites. They crushed the sons of Israel for 18 years. This period is perhaps best remembered for a vow made by the first of these 4 judges. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord that if God would give him a victory, he would offer the first thing to come out from his house as a burnt offering to the Lord. God gave him a great victory, but when he returned home to Mizpah in Ephraim, his only child, a daughter, was coming out to meet him with tambourines and with dancing. Wow. There's some controversy as to what actually took place after Jephthah said, I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back. Some scholars say that she was then sacrificed, and some say that she was thereafter consigned to perpetual virginity and service in the sanctuary. And there are strong arguments for both theories. It's clear, however, that the Mosaic law expressly forbade human sacrifice. So you be the judge. 3 more judges followed Jephthah in this cycle of idolatry, chastening, and deliverance, but no period of peace. They are Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And finally, the 7th cycle. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. The Israelites accepted their rule on this occasion without resistance, by the way. There's no biblical record that they even cried out to God for deliverance, as at other times. Nevertheless, God raised up the last and perhaps the most remarkable judge of them all in Samson from the tribe of Dan. Samson was unique in that he was called to his judicial post before he was born. His mother was barren, and she and her husband received a visit from the angel of the Lord, yet another Christophany, telling her she would bear a son to be raised as a Nazirite to God. His hair was not to be cut. He was not to consume wine or strong drink or eat anything that was unclean. But he would begin, the Bible says in Judges 13:5, he would begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. It's of note that the Holy Spirit employed here the word begin, for the Philistines continued to be a threat to Israel clear into the reign of King David. Samson's life was characterized by amazing strength and overpowering feats of daring. And you all know the account, how that the secret of his strength was revealed. His head was shorn in Delilah's clip joint, and the Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, and chained him to a grinding wheel in the prison. And while in prison, his hair began to grow, until the Philistines held a great sacrifice to Dagon, the national god of Philistia. And they brought Samson out to amuse themselves, not perceiving his strength had returned, and they chained him between two pillars that supported their temple. And Samson called on the Lord for one more outpouring of strength, and pushed against the pillars and brought down the roof. And in that final act died with the Philistines. And the Philistines that he killed in death were more than he killed in life. Now, we should note that throughout this entire narrative, the spiritual state of the sons of Israel progressively declined. God gave them at least 7 opportunities to repent and turn back to him, but each generation returned to idolatry, and in doing so, they spurned the grace and the glory of God. We must also observe that the era of the judges, in which everyone did what was right in their own eyes, ended with frightening consequences. The closing chapters lay out 2 tragic accounts of idolatry, apostasy, and vengeance, debauchery. It's significant that both instances of the concluding description of this era, every man did what was right in his own eyes, are found in the record of these 2 incidents. I'm convinced that if the sons of Israel had walked before God, the last 5 chapters of Judges would not have taken place. They are punctuated not only by the satanic friendship of the people, but particularly by the sinful failure of the priests. The first of them involved Micah's idolatrous ambition in Judges 17 and 18. Micah was in the tribe of Ephraim. He aspired to build idols for himself, and he engaged a Levite from Bethlehem to take up residence as a household priest. Furthermore, the Levite constructed for himself an ephod, a vestment for a high priest. Micah foolishly reasoned that God would prosper him because he had employed a Levite, a priest. It happened that a large portion of the tribe of Dan had grown dissatisfied with the land allotted to them. They were seeking greener pastures to the north, and they passed through Ephraim and came upon Micah and his Levite priest. They made the wayward priest a better offer and absconded with the priest and Micah's idols, and they set up the idols far to the north, where they rebuilt their city, and they named it Dan. Now, the consequence of that is rather interesting. The significance is that the wayward Levite is shown to be a grandson of Moses, and the false worship they set up became the forerunner of the religion of Jeroboam, who you'll hear about, I suspect, next week, who later established a shrine for the northern divided kingdom to worship at Dan. So, a consequence of the idolatry first embraced in the era of the Judges. A second event, even more sordid, also involved an apostate priest. Yet another Levite who was living in a remote part of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem who left him and went back to her father. He retrieved her, and on the journey home they stopped in Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin, where they were invited to stay with a kind old man. But some worthless fellows pounded on the door demanding to have homosexual relations with the Levite. Reminiscent of the events of Sodom in Genesis 19, they offered instead the Levite's concubine, and they raped and abused her all night. And in the morning, the concubine was found dead on the doorstep. The priest cut her body into 12 pieces, shipped a piece to each of the tribes, demanding retribution against Benjamin. This led to a civil war as 11 of the tribes came against the tribe of Benjamin. In the last battle, 25,000 Benjamite men were killed, pretty much wiping out the tribe. Well, that's not the whole story, but I hope it encourages you to read through these books in the coming days. It's not all bad news. The account of Ruth presents us with one of the most beautiful Old Testament pictures of Christ, our kinsman redeemer. And it took place at the same time frame as the book of Judges. So it's a beautiful story. Well, as I read through Joshua and Judges, I can't help but draw association with our own day and time. We dwell in the land given us by God for about the same number of years. We do not inherit the same promise as Israel with regard to our land, but we have covenanted together, even in our founding documents, to fear God. We've been graced with several occasions in which God has miraculously intervened to deliver us from fierce enemies. We have fought overwhelming odds and trusted God for victory. We have prospered by God's hands and enjoyed his beneficence time and time again. And we have seen our nation decline morally and spiritually from generation to generation. There have been periods of repentance, calling upon God, and yet the name of God is bandied about as common. The Word of God and even the mention of God is discouraged in our schools and public institutions. We do not live in a land where children are sacrificed to pagan idols, but we have murdered almost 62 million unborn children since 1973. Morally, we have a great deal in common with the declivity of the sons of Israel in these 300 years or so in the Promised Land. Might we not learn from their example and cleave to God with greater determination and devotion than what we see demonstrated in our text? Might we not read this inspired history with an eye to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that we might be filled up to all the fullness of God? I trust so. Appreciate your attention. I've taken you through some 350 years or more of exciting history. And if you have any questions, we have 6 minutes left. 7 minutes left. Be glad to take them. If not, you're out of here early. Okay? God bless you. Oh, we have your homework to give you. Oops.
I knew that was coming. I just had a feeling.